For roughly 200 days out of every year, the average Slavic peasant ate no meat, no eggs, no milk, and no butter. Not by choice, by rule. For the other 165 days, he lived in a place where the soil stayed frozen iron hard for nearly half the calendar, where nothing green grew from October to April, and where one failed harvest could erase a village. By every standard a modern nutritionist would apply, this should have been a slow starvation diet that produced weak, short, sickly people. So why did this exact way of eating feed the populations that built the largest land empires the world has ever seen, held the eastern edge of Europe for 1,000 years, and outlasted the kingdoms that looked down on them as savages? The answer is sitting in a wooden barrel in a cellar, and almost nobody alive today understands how it actually worked. Eastern Europe, somewhere on the Great Plain east of the Vistula, any year between the 9th century and the 18th. The landscape changes very little, and neither does the central problem. Winter arrives in October and refuses to leave until April. For close to 6 months, the ground is too hard to dig, the rivers lock solid under ice, and not a single fresh vegetable grows anywhere within reach. A family that intends to eat in February has to have decided what they would eat back in August. Survival on this plain was never really about what you could grow in the short, frantic summer. It was about what you could keep through the long, dead months that followed. That one fact shaped every plate, every barrel, and every habit in the peasant household, and it forced these people to invent a food system so efficient that it carried them through famines and invasions that wiped softer civilizations off the map. Start with the foundation of the entire diet, the thing that was on the table at nearly every meal of a peasant's life. Kasha. The word covers any boiled whole grain, and across the Slavic world that meant buckwheat first, then millet, then barley, oats, and rye. Buckwheat earned the top spot for a simple reason. It grows fast in poor, acidic soil, it resists cold, and once the groats are dried, they store for years in a sack without spoiling. To this day, Russia remains the largest buckwheat producer on Earth, and for most of its history, buckwheat made up around 1/5 of all the grain its people ate. A handful of those groats, a pot, water, and a fire produced a dense, slow-burning meal that sat in the stomach for hours. The peasant was eating complex carbohydrate that released energy gradually across a day of brutal physical labour, with no sugar spike and no afternoon crash. This grain was not just food, it was identity, and it was treated almost as sacred. Russian proverbs preserve the whole worldview in a single line. Shchida kasha, pishcha nasha. Cabbage soup and porridge are our food. Another goes further. Kasha is our mother, and rye bread is our father. The 12th century Primary Chronicle, the oldest written history of the region, describes warring princes sealing peace by sitting down to eat porridge together, because sharing a pot of kasha was a binding act, a treaty you could swallow. A sweet grain porridge with honey and dried fruit called kutia was cooked for funerals and Christmas alike. And underneath all of it sat the Chernozem, the black earth belt running across Ukraine and southern Russia, some of the most fertile soil that exists anywhere on the planet. That soil produced grain surpluses, and grain surpluses are what let a scattering of river principalities fund armies, feed cities, and push outward across a continent. The empire did not move on meat. It moved on a sack of dried buckwheat and a communal cooking pot. And that pot followed the armies. When Slavic soldiers marched, they marched on kasha, cooked over a shared fire by a designated cook for a unit that pooled its rations and ate together. A man could be fed for weeks off grain that weighed almost nothing dry, needed no refrigeration, and turned into a hot meal anywhere there was water and fuel. The same logistics that let a peasant survive a frozen February let an army cross enormous distances without a supply chain of fresh food behind it. That is not a small advantage. That is the kind of advantage that decides who holds a frontier and who loses it, and it is a large part of why the powers built on this grain kept expanding east while better-fed rivals to the west stalled out. What comes next is the part that still doesn't quite make sense to anyone raised with a refrigerator. The peasant had almost no way to keep food cold, no canning, no freezing, no reliable way to preserve a vegetable in its fresh state. So he did something cleverer. He let the food rot on purpose under controlled conditions and turned the rotting itself into the preservation. The centerpiece of that system was cabbage. Shredded fine, packed into a barrel with nothing but salt and weighed down under its own brine, the cabbage fermented. Lactic acid bacteria ate the sugars, the pH dropped, and the result was sauerkraut, kapusta, a barrel of sour cabbage that stayed edible for the entire winter. Boiled with whatever else was on hand, it became shchi, the national soup, the other half of that proverb about porridge. Here is the detail that should stop you. That barrel of fermented cabbage was not just calories, it was a vitamin C reservoir. Lactofermentation preserves the vitamin C in cabbage, and in some cases concentrates it, which means the Slavic peasant had a steady supply of it all winter long, exactly when no fresh produce existed for thousands of miles. While European navies were watching sailors die of scurvy on long voyages, and while military doctors spent centuries arguing about the cause, the landlocked peasant in a frozen village had quietly solved the problem with a barrel and a handful of salt. He never wrote it down as medicine. You'd think someone would have. Nobody did. It was just what was in the cellar, next to the fermented cucumbers, the soured apples, and the salted mushrooms. The cellar, the pogreb, was effectively a low-temperature chemistry lab, and every household ran one, and for many centuries this held. The grain, the barrel, the cellar, the cycle of summer harvest and winter survival, repeating generation after generation. In a little under 100 years from the height of this system, the people living on it would learn exactly what it felt like to have a brand new food forced onto them at the point of a bayonet. But that part of the story comes later. There was a second force shaping this diet, and it came not from the climate but from the church. The Orthodox calendar imposed fasting, and it imposed a staggering amount of it. Across the 4 great fasting seasons, plus every Wednesday and Friday of the year, a devout Orthodox peasant spent somewhere between 180 and 200 days annually abstaining from animal products. On the strict days that meant no meat, no dairy, no eggs, often no fish, and on the hardest days no oil and no wine either. This was not an occasional sacrifice. It was more than half the year, every year, for life. The practical effect was enormous. The entire cuisine had to be built so that it could run for months at a time on grain, vegetables, mushrooms, hemp and flax oil, and honey alone. There was a whole parallel kitchen, the Lenten table, designed for exactly this. The people who fasted for 200 days a year were, by definition, a people who knew how to eat well without animals. For the days when animal food was allowed, the peasant again leaned on fermentation. Fresh milk spoils within hours in a warm hut, so it was rarely drunk fresh. Instead, it was soured deliberately into tvarog, a fresh curd cheese, into smetana, a thick sour cream, and into prostokvasha and ryazhenka, cultured soured milks that kept longer and digested easier. Controlled souring, again doing the work that refrigeration does for us. The one concentrated fat in the system was salo, slabs of pork back fat cured in salt, sliced thin onto dark rye bread and eaten with raw garlic. It was winter fuel, energy you could carry in a pocket, and in much of the region it became a point of cultural pride that survives to this day. Most people have never heard about the next part because it didn't come from a field or a barn at all. It came from the forest, which functioned as the peasant's second pantry and his pharmacy. Mushrooms were gathered by the basket load in autumn, threaded onto strings, and dried above the stove until they were leathery and nearly weightless. Rehydrated through the winter, they were called the meat of the poor for good reason, dense with savoury flavour and a little protein when no animal was being killed. Wild berries like lingonberry and bilberry were stored in water or their own juice with no sugar at all, because the berries are naturally high in benzoic acid, a built-in preservative. In early spring, before any crop came up, the peasant ate the first wild greens, sorrel, nettles, wild garlic, partly as food and partly as medicine, the body's first fresh nutrients after a long winter of stored calories. And then there was honey, which mattered more than almost anything else on this list. Sugar did not exist in Eastern Europe for most of this period, so honey was the only real sweetener, and it carried enormous economic weight. Slavic forest beekeeping, botniczeństwo, involved keeping wild bee colonies in hollowed-out trees and harvesting both honey and beeswax. Wax was a major export, burned as candles across the churches of Europe, and honey and wax were taxed by princes and used as tribute and currency. Kievan Rus grew genuinely wealthy moving these forest goods west. Honey also powered the drinks. The everyday beverage was kvass, fermented from stale rye bread into a slightly sour, barely alcoholic drink that was safer than the local water and brewed fresh in nearly every household. The celebration drink was mead, fermented honey, older in the region than any distilled spirit. The primary chronicle even records a ruler weighing religions and balking at one, partly because it would have banned drink, a small line that tells you how central fermented honey was to the culture. In winter, a hot-spiced honey drink called spuyten warmed the hands and the chest. None of it required a single coin paid to a market. That same self-sufficiency runs through the one staple people ask about most, the bread. If you want to bake the dark sourdough rye that anchored this diet, it is the focus of the medieval bakery line at medievalway.store. The sourdough manual covers the starter and the bake, practical recipes gives you the loaves, and the sourcing guide points you to the right flour. Links are in the description. Now back to what nearly ended it all. By the middle of the 18th century, this 1,000-year-old way of eating had a threat heading straight for it, and the threat was small enough to hold in one hand. To understand it, you have to know what the peasant's everyday root vegetable actually was before this point, because it was not the potato. It was the turnip, the reaper, boiled and baked and stored in the cellar, the humble filler that bulked out soups and survived the winter. The potato simply did not exist in this diet. It arrived as a foreign object, and it arrived by decree. Peter I reportedly sent a sack back from Holland, but it was Catherine the Great who pushed hardest, and an official order in 1765 began promoting potato cultivation across the empire. The same state that lived off the peasant's grain surplus now decided to override the peasant's own diet from above. Authorities took some of the best peasant land for state-run potato fields and enforced planting with real punishment for refusal. And that was not even the part that made people angry. The orthodox peasantry, and the old believers in particular, looked at this strange tuber that grew hidden in the dark underground, that appeared nowhere in scripture, and they decided it was unclean. They called it the devil's apple. They called it dog eggs. They refused. What followed is one of the most overlooked food rebellions in European history. The potato riots broke out among appanage peasants in 1834, then exploded among state peasants between 1840 and 1844. In the Urals and the lower Volga region, more than 500,000 peasants rose up, tore the potato plantings out of the ground, beat the officials sent to enforce the policy, and fought the troops sent to put them down. The government answered the way governments did. Soldiers were sent in, people were shot over a vegetable, thousands were convicted and exiled to Siberia or forced into the army. So yes, the transition was anything but smooth. It is tempting to write this off as backward superstition, peasants too ignorant to recognize a good crop. That reading is lazy. These were people defending a food system that had kept their ancestors alive through 1,000 winters, against a distant state forcing an untested foreign plant onto their most valuable land under threat of punishment. They lost in the end. By 1881, the potato covered well over 1.5 million hectares of Russian soil and earned the nickname second bread. The old world of the turnip and the barrel slowly faded into the background. 1,000 years of accumulated survival knowledge, overruled by a royal decree and a sack of tubers. So how do you actually eat like this today, now that the ingredients are mostly sitting on a normal grocery shelf? Start with the kasha, because it anchors everything. Take a cup of toasted buckwheat groats, pour in about 2 cups of water or stock, add salt, bring it to a boil, then drop the heat and let it simmer covered for roughly 20 to 25 minutes until the grain is tender and the liquid is gone. Stir in a knob of butter, or good oil if you want the fast day version, and top it with onions and mushrooms browned in a pan. That single dish was the spine of the entire peasant week. For your own winter vitamin reservoir, make sauerkraut. Shred a head of cabbage, weigh it, and add salt at about 2% of that weight, which works out to roughly a tablespoon per pound. Massage the salt in until the cabbage releases its own liquid, pack it tight into a clean jar so the brine covers it completely, and leave it at room temperature for 1 to 2 weeks, tasting as it goes. That barrel logic, scaled down to a jar on your counter, is the same chemistry that kept scurvy out of a frozen village. For the drink, you can ferment a quick bread kvass from toasted rye bread, water, a little honey, and a pinch of yeast over a couple of days, or simply buy a bottle to taste what they were drinking. The principle underneath all of it is consistent. Grain you cook yourself, vegetables you ferment yourself, fat and protein in small concentrated doses, honey in place of refined sugar, and sour fermented drinks in place of soda. One honest caveat, the same one I gave for the Roman diet. This way of eating evolved for people burning through a hard day of physical labour and observing genuine fasts, and it leans heavy on grain and starch. If you are sitting at a desk all day, do not eat 3 bowls of buttered kasha and a slab of salo and expect to feel light. Lean on the fermented vegetables and the mushrooms. Keep the grain portions sensible. Go easy on the cured fat and the bread, and what you are left with is a high-fibre, probiotic-rich, genuinely cheap way of eating that most cardiologists would happily sign off on. Look back at the frozen ground we started with, the 6 months of dead soil and the 200 days without meat, and the word starvation falls apart completely. This was never starvation. It was the most sophisticated low-technology food preservation system in pre-modern Europe, built by people with no science degrees and no equipment beyond a barrel, a knife, and a cellar, and it fed the populations that spread across 1/3 of the northern world. We are still rediscovering, piece by piece, with laboratories and studies, the things they already knew by the time they were old enough to lift a cabbage. If this is the kind of buried history you want more of, hit that like button so it gets pushed to the next person who thinks peasants just ate gruel and suffered. Drop a comment telling me which one you would try first, the kasha or the kvass, because I genuinely want to know where people start. And subscribe if you want the next investigation into the forgotten diets that built the civilizations we are still living in the shadow of. We are bringing this knowledge back one video at a time,